Okay, we're going to begin the second video lecture for the European section of Module 3. And what I want to do in this lecture is discuss some of the major human geography issues facing Europe today, as well as kind of the historical geographic context of the region. So in doing this, let's look again at our region. And what we're going to see here is the states of the European region. And not surprisingly, these are the states that most of us are familiar with. It's a fairly complex landscape of relatively small states occupying, again, the peninsulas and the coastal regions of this, the oldest, if you will, of the world's western regions. But what's important when we look at this landscape is that these are modern states, and that this characteristic of these relatively modern states has some implications in terms of current geopolitical issues. So let's look at this landscape in terms of some of the background cultural characteristics. If we begin with the geography of language in the region, what I want you to focus on here is that in fact there are a number of major language families present, and in addition to all of the specific languages that we're familiar with. The first characteristic geographically is that the Germanic languages largely reside in the northern and northwestern portions of Europe, and the Romance languages reside largely in the south and southwestern portion. And then to the east, we have this group of Slavic and the Uralic languages kind of intermixed with the other major kind of geographic landscapes. So let's kind of take this apart and think about what this really means. Well, if we look at the Germanic landscape, what we are seeing here is a series of states or histories of states that are dominated by a common language group. In the same way, in the south, we can see a similar common language group in the Romance languages. Romance languages are worth understanding as those languages that have developed out of the Latin language that dominated the Roman Empire. So in the Romance languages, again, we see the dominant ones we're familiar with, and that is the French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. These languages all have that common characteristic to them, and what is important to understand is that many of these languages are somewhat understandable across different countries. So in other words, someone that speaks Italian has some sense fairly easily of understanding Spanish or Portuguese, or to a degree French. In a somewhat less true way, you can also think of the Germanic languages this way. In other words, German and English by no means are mutually understandable, but they do have certain words or phrasings or grammatical structures that make them somewhat similar. Now, as we move away from the Germanic languages and the Romance languages into the Slavic language groups, what we first see is that in some of these languages we're actually moving across into a somewhat different language in terms of its letters or its written form. This is also true as we move into the Greek based languages. In other words, if you look to the south and you look at the Greek language and certainly the Basque languages, we're going to begin to see some really different languages, both in terms of the writing and in terms of their spoken characteristics. But what I want you to think about as we look at this landscape then is that languages would be one way of breaking the region. And we can see fairly clearly that it does make sense to break Eastern and Western Europe this way, and certainly Southern Europe from Northern Europe. But then we have the issues of Germany and France, which really represent the core of Europe. And how does that very clear divide of language then come into play? Well, let's take a look one step further and put another layer, if you will, of culture on this. And what we see here is another fairly substantial divide. What you see on this map, in terms of kind of the pinkish colors, if you will, are the religions that essentially evolved out of Catholicism. So if we think about Catholicism starting, and it really did start in Rome much more than you want to understand it in terms of starting in Israel, So we have the Roman Church essentially occupying much of Western Europe, and the first major divide between it and the Orthodox churches of the East. So we can see Europe divided here very clearly between the Orthodox religion of the East, still a Christian religion, and the Roman, and by extension Catholic, Lutheran, the Protestant Reformation, and by extension further from that, the Church of England. But we have all of the Catholic-based versus all of the Orthodox-based. The other thing that you should note on this map is the areas of Islamic dominance, and you'll notice that most importantly in what we will see later on as the Shatter Belt region. So we now see a couple of landscapes of culture that divide the region into kind of big areas. Now if we take it one step further, we can see then that Europe has, in a sense, its different sub-regions. In the north, okay, the Northern European sub-region clearly aligns itself with the Protestant characteristics and with the Germanic languages. Southern Europe largely is divided along a Catholic or Christian and the Romance languages, with the exception, of course, of Greece. And then Eastern Europe has its influences of the Orthodox Church, and then a kind of a combination of the Serbian language groups and those of the Germanic groups. And so in this kind of Eastern European, you'll notice that there's a little bit more complexity. And what we're going to see again is that that influences area that we're going to call the Shatter Belt. All right, so let's take this one step further. Today, contemporary Europe is defined essentially by those that are members of the European Union, those that are not members, and those that want to be members. And so if we look at the landscape of the European Union in 2015, you'll notice that virtually all of the states of Europe, with a few notable exceptions, are members. You'll notice that Norway is not part of the European Union, nor is Switzerland. We see that in this case, Serbia wants to be part of the Union, as does Albania, as does Macedonia, as does Turkey. These are candidate states. And so then we begin to ask the question, what is pushing states towards membership? What is pulling states away from membership? And so the European Union, again, what we want to think about here is the European Union retains, all of the states retain sovereignty, but they must abide by certain agreements. And as you read the text, think about what those agreements hold central and which ones are somewhat marginal to it. One of the most important characteristics of the European Union is the eurozone. And the eurozone simply means those states that use the euro as a currency, a single currency across the region. And again, it's important to note which states are part of the eurozone, which are not. The eurozone means, again, that a currency, a single currency is used, and that a single, in a sense, banking system or setting of the value of the currency is present. Now, what you'll also notice in this area, though, is that some countries have floating currencies. Some have their currency, for example, Denmark has their currency pegged to the euro, and then there are some in here that have their own currency that works independently, most notably the British pound. But again, this is a very important aspect of the European region. So the European Union, a group of states that voluntarily participate in the organization. The eurozone, areas that use a currency. And then we have something called the Schengen zone. And the Schengen states, and you'll notice that the majority of Europe is Schengen states. The Schengen zone is an area where once you're inside, you can move freely through the states without the need of a passport. And so again, Schengen states are those that allow ease of movement through them. Of course, you'll notice that those that are non-EU states are not part of it. But in addition, some of the EU states are also not a part of it, most notably the United Kingdom. So Schengen, as you read about it, is about movement and the movement of goods and services. Now, we can also look at the European Union as an evolving landscape, and as you read it, please take the time to look at when these states came in and which regions came in earliest and latest. And you'll notice that the earliest members of the European Union represent the European core. All right, we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up very briefly with the concepts of devolution in the next video.